On September 7, 1940, a Luftwaffe reconnaissance plane flew over southern England at 25,000 feet. Its Zeiss camera clicked steadily as it completed its mission. The pilot turned over Cambridge, capturing photos of what his briefing notes marked as RAF Bassingbourn, a major bomber training base opened just 2 years before. But when the film reached the photo interpretation unit at Zossen, 12 miles southeast of Berlin, the analysts frowned as they examined the stereoscopic images. The vast airfield built by John Laying and Son between 1937 and 1939, with 4 seaplane-style hangars and full facilities, seemed to be turning back into farmland. Painted lines resembling hedges stretched across the concrete between runways, and rectangular patches looked like real growing crops. The site was downgraded in the Luftwaffe's target folder. Why waste bombs on an airfield that looked barely active? Yet this wasn't abandoned land. RAF Bassingbourn was one of Britain's busiest training bases, operating 54 Wellington bombers and hosting thousands of staff. What the Germans saw from 6 miles up was the result of a clever deception that became standard across Britain, disguising airfields to look like the countryside they had replaced. Those green strips between the concrete weren't signs of neglect, they were part of the plan. And the brilliance lay not just in painting fake hedgerows, but in actually planting real crops between the runways. Standard military thinking in 1940 favored large, obvious airfields. The Luftwaffe's own manuals demanded clearly marked bases with big hangars, wide aprons, and neat layouts. American strategists agreed. Airfields should be practical first, with camouflage added later. Critics said hiding something as huge as an airfield, often covering 400 to 600 acres, was impossible after all. The concrete runways alone made geometric patterns visible even from 30,000 feet. RAF Sudbury, opened in 1944, had 3 crossing concrete runways up to 1,025 meters long, 50 hardstands, and 2 T2 hangars. How could anyone hide that? But the British realized something their enemies didn't. Luftwaffe photo interpreters weren't perfect. They were young men under heavy pressure, scanning hundreds of images daily, looking for familiar signs. In 1935, Air Ministry report stressed that camouflage didn't have to make an airfield invisible. It just needed to delay recognition long enough to throw off targeting. Even confusing an enemy pilot's view for 30 seconds could mean the difference between a direct hit and a scattered bomb drop. Britain's camouflage policy, formalized in 1938, relied on a simple farming insight. Much of Britain was still a patchwork of small fields divided by old hedgerows. A Luftwaffe reconnaissance photo from 1939 showed what analysts expected: small, irregular plots separated by dark boundary lines and different shades of soil. Most farms were under 100 acres, with fewer than 10 cows each. The countryside looked like a quilt of pastures, ploughed earth and crops. So if an airfield copied that pattern, even roughly, it could blend into the landscape surprisingly well. The technique went far beyond painting lines on the grass. At RAF Station Stanton, opened in 1940, camouflage teams created a fake country lane running diagonally across the runways. Boundaries imitating hedges were painted directly onto the turf in realistic patterns. Irregular black lines were added, and parts of the runways were painted with uneven, dark shapes to mimic small wooded areas. At RAF Yaden, now Leeds Bradford Airport, photos from July 27, 1940, show painted hedge lines crossing the runway to break up its straight, unnatural shape. But the real breakthrough wasn't in paint, it was in living plants. When RAF Bassingbourn finished building its concrete runways during the winter of 1941 to 42, 3 intersecting strips totaling nearly 11,000 feet, the Air Ministry ordered that the open areas between them should look like real farmland. Not just be painted to look like it, but actually farmed. This meant real cultivation. The grassy zones between the concrete strips, often 50 to 150 yards wide, were ploughed, seeded, and maintained as active farmland. Some airfields grew wheat, Others grew hay or short grass for drying operations. The variety itself made the disguise more convincing. A Luftwaffe analyst studying the photos would see the natural colour changes of British crops, not the perfectly uniform green of airfield grass. The practical difficulties were major. Farming on an active airbase required careful coordination between flight operations and agricultural work. Safety rules stated that grass close to the runways couldn't exceed 4 inches in height. Any taller, and it could endanger aircraft making emergency landings. But in wider sections between runways, where flying wasn't affected, crops could grow freely. In 1954, parliamentary debate on food production at RAF sites revealed how complex this dual use was. Of 176,000 acres of RAF land reviewed, around 93,000 acres were fit for farming. Of that, 41,500 acres could be used for general agriculture, 26,000 for grass farming, and 23,000 for grass drying purposes. One MP from Tunbridge asked whether tall corn crops, over 2 feet high, could pose safety risks. The Under-Secretary confirmed that wheat and barley were banned near active runways, but allowed in non-operational zones. This dual purpose was vital to wartime survival. Before the war, Britain imported 70% of its food, including 90% of its cereals and fats, and German U-boat attacks had pushed the nation toward hunger. The government's Plough Up campaign sought to turn millions of acres of pasture into cropland, especially for wheat and potatoes. 1 acre of wheat saved the same amount of shipping space as 7 acres of grass. Between 1939 and 1941, more than 4 million acres were newly cultivated, and Airfields joined this national farming drive. The deception worked because it took advantage of how humans recognize patterns. Luftwaffe photo interpreters were trained to spot specific features: the clean geometry of concrete runways, the distinctive outlines of hangars, the circular layouts of hardstands, and the straight lines of access roads. A 1940 reconnaissance image of RAF South Cerney shows this process clearly. The Fliegerplatz, airfield, is circled in red with numbered notes pointing out aircraft parking zones, 4 hangars, barracks, control towers, and radio masts. Yet, as the caption explained, the grassy takeoff and landing zones inside the lower circular area had been camouflaged with painted field boundaries. From 25,000 feet, the usual reconnaissance height, these markings looked like genuine hedgerows. Through the stereoscopic viewers used by the Luftwaffe, photo interpreters used stereoscopic viewers to get a 3-dimensional view of the landscape. This sometimes helped them see through background camouflage, but at very high altitudes, they still couldn't tell painted lines from real plants. The real strength of Britain's disguise was the mixed crops between the runways, which produced exactly the tones analysts expected from genuine farmland. A wheat field looked pale gold, young barley a deeper green, freshly turned soil appeared dark brown, and pasture showed soft grey-green. Together, these shades created the natural patchwork of agricultural land. Bassingbourn's camouflage was tested many times. On 28 May 1940, a lone German bomber dropped 10 bombs on it. Between March and August 1941, as one of the busiest training bases in the East, it was hit occasionally. On 13th of August 1941, 4 bombs fell, one striking a barrack block and killing 10 people. But these were small raids, not the heavy bombardments aimed at major targets. Luftwaffe target files explain why. Bassingbourn was known but never considered important enough to prioritize. The camouflage didn't make it vanish. It made it seem unimportant. RAF Tempsford showed this deception even more clearly. Built at Gibraltar Farm near Sandy, Bedfordshire, the site seemed poor for flying, foggy, damp and uneven. British planners realized those flaws could help hide it. German scouts would assume the same. To strengthen the illusion, lines were painted across runways to mimic hedgerows, and hangars were disguised as old farm sheds. Tempsford became home to No. 138 Special Duty Squadron, which dropped agents and supplies for the SOE, SIS, MI9, and resistance groups across Europe. It was one of Britain's most secret bases, yet it looked like scruffy farmland for the whole war. The camouflage wasn't perfect, and officials knew it. Stations such as RAF Catterick near the coast often suffered attacks despite painted buildings. Traces of camouflage still mark the officers' mess today. By 1941, Luftwaffe reconnaissance itself was weakening. Shortages of film and aircraft meant poorer images, and bomber crews complained about fuzzy prints. Even so, major targets could still be spotted. What the British achieved was not invisibility, but confusion. A 1940 aerial photo captured by Belgian resistance agents proved its value. Analysts could tell an airfield existed, but not its exact layout or importance, without more flights. That delay cost the Germans time, and time meant lost chances. Intelligence 3 days late might already be outdated. Camouflage forced German planners to waste resources on harmless decoys or low-priority fields. The agricultural element deepened the illusion precisely because it was real. Decoy airfields such as RAF Rowton near Swindon could look convincing at first, but keeping the deception alive required endless repainting and upkeep. Paint soon faded, and canvas decoys quickly wore out. But a real wheat field photographed in May 1941 showed genuine growth, and by July, its golden harvest tones appeared naturally. That seasonal change convinced observers that these were real farms, not military sites. This was deliberate, not nostalgia. Commanders knew battlefields weren't clean laboratories. Luftwaffe interpreters were skilled, but they had to process thousands of images fast, searching for obvious military threats. Any airfield that demanded close study that didn't instantly match the expected pattern would likely be ignored in favor of clearer targets. The camouflage didn't rely on invisibility, but on doubt. The key insight was that military structures exist within the landscape, not apart from it. The Luftwaffe expected British airfields to resemble German ones, industrial, orderly, and unmistakably military. Instead, they found fields that looked like part of the countryside. This wasn't artistic, it was strategic information denial. Every hour, a German analyst spent double-checking whether a farm was actually an airfield, was an hour not spent on true targets. When American forces arrived from 1942 onward, they were skeptical. The 91st Bomb Group, flying B-17 Flying Fortresses, moved into RAF Bassingbourn on October 14, 1942. Used to open, functional US bases, they saw Britain's rural camouflage as old-fashioned. But soon they understood its brilliance. German reconnaissance flights were constant, and precise bombing required up-to-date intelligence. Bases that looked agricultural from above, even if listed in enemy files, were rated as lower priority than those that appeared clearly military. After the war, a 1954 parliamentary debate revealed how deeply agriculture had been woven into the RAF's operations. Of Britain's 176,000 acres of airfield land, more than half had been opened for farming during the conflict. The Undersecretary for Air explained that before the war, ploughing inside airfields was banned. But wartime regulations reduced the width of grass safety zones around runways, freeing more ground for cultivation. Grass drying work, which used short young grass just as airfields required, became the perfect dual-purpose task. These crops weren't just camouflage, they were valuable to the food economy. One MP proposed that grass drying, despite needing costly machines and long leases, should be expanded on RAF land to boost food output while preserving disguise. The practice continued long after 1945. Bases kept in care and maintenance often had crops growing between runways, both as cover and for profit. RAF Mount Farm, for example, was returned from American control in May 1945, but stayed in agricultural use until full refarming began in 1949. The airfield was sold for agriculture in 1957, with part later turned over to gravel extraction in 1961. The conversion from base to true farmland was effortless because the illusion had always been. Real military critics who dismissed British camouflage as pointless had misunderstood several things. First, they assumed intelligence was perfect. In reality, even the Luftwaffe's detailed reconnaissance program, which photographed nearly every part of Britain from Orkney to Cornwall between 1935 and 1941, couldn't keep up-to-date intelligence on all sites. Priorities had to be made, and camouflage directly shaped those priorities. Critics misunderstood this. They saw camouflage as all or nothing, either perfect invisibility or a wasted effort. But operational deception works in shades. If an airfield appears only 60% as threatening as it really is, it automatically receives less attention. That shift in focus leaves gaps in surveillance, and those gaps become strategic opportunities. Another mistake was underestimating how mentally demanding photo interpretation was. By 1941, Luftwaffe reconnaissance teams were overworked and short on resources. Image quality had dropped, and bomber crews often complained that their target photos were unclear. In that environment, camouflage that slowed analysis or required extra confirmation flights had an outsized effect. The de Havilland aircraft factory at Hatfield proved this. Magicians and set designers removed part of the roof and used smoke canisters to simulate bomb damage. When a German plane photographed it, analysts downgraded the site, thinking it had already been destroyed. The illusion wasn't perfect. It wouldn't fool anyone on the ground, but from the air it worked. For those stationed at camouflaged bases, farming life was just part of the job. At RAF Bassingbourn, ground crews worked on Wellington bombers between real wheat fields. At Tempsford, secret agents preparing for missions into occupied Europe passed hangars painted to look like barns. The mix of intense military activity and rural calm felt strange at first, but soon became normal. American crews arriving in 1943 and 1944 for D-Day were amazed. One B-17 pilot at a hidden East Anglian base described the surreal sight: concrete runways lined with painted hedges, dispersal bays next to genuine crop fields, and the steady buzz of farm machinery blending with aircraft engines. Even the mighty Lancaster bombers, needing long, wide runways, took off from bases that from above still looked like patchwork farmland. The grassy zones required constant care from airfield construction units. At RAF Elgin in Scotland, opened in June 1940 as a satellite for RAF Lossiemouth, drainage problems from heavy use forced engineers to install a full bar and rod system by 1944. Balancing functionality and disguise was ongoing work. Yet this upkeep, cutting grass, managing water flow, shifting traffic areas, made the fields look genuinely farmed in aerial photos. Real farms showed signs of attention and order, and so did these bases. What made the deception succeed wasn't one single trick, but a whole system. From 1938 onward, camouflage became part of airfield design itself. Paint alone could be spotted. Crops alone could be removed for construction. But together, with irregular layouts, scattered buildings, camouflaged roofs, and Britain's naturally uneven landscape, they created an image so complex that even expert analysts struggled to interpret it quickly. The Luftwaffe expected airfields to declare their presence boldly. The RAF built airfields that whispered. It wasn't about advanced technology. The tools were simple: paint, crops, and canvas. What mattered was the idea behind them. True concealment isn't about becoming invisible. It's about shaping what the enemy sees and when they see it. The math proved its worth. If camouflage delayed the Luftwaffe's recognition of RAF Bassingbourn by just 3 reconnaissance flights, one in May, another in June for confirmation, and a third in July to check updates that cost time, fuel, and manpower. Each Dornier 17P reconnaissance mission from occupied France to Cambridge consumed resources. Multiply that delay across dozens of camouflaged airfields, and the total intelligence strain became massive. More importantly, out-of-date or uncertain information meant attacks were based on the wrong data. A base photographed in April might have new aircraft or layouts by June. Bombers arriving with April's maps would find reality had changed. This wasn't theory. Personnel at Bassingbourn, Elgin, and many other airfields saw raids that were mistimed, inaccurate, or surprisingly light for such vital targets. Camouflage didn't prevent attacks, but it made them far less effective. By 1943, as Allied air power took control over Europe, Britain no longer relied heavily on deception. Luftwaffe reconnaissance had nearly collapsed, yet the marks of the camouflage remained. Post-war aerial photos show faded painted hedgerows on concrete, and fields between runways returned to real farmland, ghostly reminders of when war and agriculture shared the same ground. When the Luftwaffe's own archives were declassified in 1974, they confirmed the success. Target folders showed British bases identified, but wrongly evaluated. Notes expressed doubt about their status. Analysts often prioritized obvious military installations over those that seemed rural. The de Havilland factory was downgraded after its fake bomb damage. RAF Tempsford was labelled as marginal farmland, even while it supported Britain's most secret missions. RAF Bassingbourn, photographed again and again, was never given the concentrated bombing its importance deserved. Today's analysts, using digital tools and endless time, can easily spot the tricks. Hedgerow lines that don't perfectly match nearby fields, or crops between runways that look too even. But Luftwaffe interpreters in 1940-43 didn't have those luxuries. They had stereoscopic viewers, tight deadlines, and thousands of possible targets across Britain. In that setting, an airfield that looked half farm and half base, showing the messy variety of English countryside instead of the crisp geometry of war, planted uncertainty. And uncertainty means delay. Delay wastes effort. Wasted effort becomes strategic advantage. The RAF didn't grow crops on airfields in spite of the war. They did it because of the war. Each acre of wheat between concrete strips served three purposes at once: feeding the nation, hiding the base, and deceiving the enemy. Every German analyst who saw those aerial photos and thought, just farmland, was seeing exactly what Britain wanted them to. This was not nostalgia for old farming traditions. It was turning the landscape itself into a weapon. The hedges that once divided English fields became painted lines of deception. The crops that fed the population became shields for air bases. The peaceful countryside, seemingly untouched by modern war, became its most powerful disguise. From 25,000 feet, German pilots saw only a patchwork of fields. They were right, but also wrong. That golden wheat might surround a busy bomber base. That green pasture might hide hard stands packed with aircraft. That quiet landscape, calm from the sky, could be the very heart of Britain's air defense. The crops grew, the bombers flew, and for crucial months in 1940 and 1941, the Luftwaffe couldn't tell the difference. That was exactly the goal.